Whatever happened to the school cafeteria? Close your eyes for a moment and think back. The smell hits you first, that particular combination of industrial steam heat, warm bread rolls, and something vaguely tomato-based that you could never quite identify but somehow didn't mind. The sound comes next, hundreds of hard-soled shoes squeaking against linoleum floors, the clatter of trays sliding along metal rails, voices bouncing off cinder block walls painted in that particular shade of institutional beige that seemed to exist nowhere else on earth. And then the feeling, that low hum of organized chaos, the rush of 100 small decisions, where to sit, what to grab, how long the line was going to be, and whether your best friend saved you a spot. For millions of American kids who came of age in the 1980s and 1990s, the school cafeteria wasn't just a place to eat lunch. It was an entire world unto itself, and yet somehow, the lunch you ate in that cafeteria has almost completely disappeared from American life. Let's go back and spend some time there. The American school cafeteria as we knew it in those decades was the product of decades of federal food policy, practical necessity, and the peculiar logic of feeding hundreds of children in under 45 minutes. The National School Lunch Program, which had been running since 1946, meant that most public schools were serving government-subsidized meals built around certain commodity foods, surplus dairy, surplus grain, surplus beef. By the time the 80s rolled around, this system had developed its own highly specific cuisine. It wasn't quite home cooking. It wasn't quite restaurant food. It was something entirely its own, and if you grew up eating it, you recognized it instantly no matter where in the country you went to school. The tray is probably the place to start, because the tray was the whole grammar of the cafeteria meal. It wasn't a plate. It wasn't a bowl. It was that rectangular molded thing, usually dark brown or olive green or occasionally a burnt orange, divided into sections that told you exactly where everything was supposed to go before you even reached the food. The compartmentalized design came from military mess hall tradition, and there was something almost ceremonial about sliding it along the steel rails while the lunch ladies, and it was nearly always women behind those counters, women in hairnets and white aprons who knew your name whether you wanted them to or not, spooned and ladled and plopped your meal into its designated quadrant, and what ended up on that tray. That is really what we're here to talk about. If you went to school anywhere in America between roughly 1980 and 1999, there is a very specific roster of dishes that probably just flashed through your memory in the last few seconds. Pizza Day was the obvious anchor of the cafeteria calendar. Not pizza as we understand it now, with artisan crusts and fresh ingredients, but that thick-doughed, slightly sweaty rectangle of a thing that somehow had its own gravitational pull. The sauce was sweeter than it should have been. The cheese had a particular orange tint that real mozzarella doesn't produce. And it came in that precise rectangular shape that fit the tray as though they had been designed together, which they essentially had. Some schools served it on a Friday as a kind of reward for surviving the week. Others rotated it in with the weekly menu on a schedule that students tracked with the same seriousness their parents tracked the stock market. Then there were the corn dogs. If pizza was the crown jewel, the corn dog was the beloved everyman. That lightly sweet cornmeal batter around a beef frank, served with a little paper cup of mustard or ketchup, was exactly the kind of food that made you feel like the day was going to be okay. It was simple, recognizable, and warm. In a social environment as unpredictable as the average middle school lunchroom, there was genuine comfort in that. Sloppy Joes held a particular place in the cafeteria mythology of this era. The name alone tells you something about the cultural attitude embedded in the menu. This was not food that was trying to be elegant. This was food that understood exactly what it was: seasoned ground beef in a tomato-based sauce, ladled onto a soft bun, guaranteed to drip on your shirt no matter how careful you were. There was a brand of sauce that many cafeteria kitchens used and many parents bought at the grocery store, and the smell of it heating up in those big industrial pans was immediately distinctive. If you were anywhere near the school between 11 and noon, you knew exactly what was for lunch without being told. Chicken patty sandwiches deserve their own moment of recognition. The breaded chicken patty on a white bun was a staple of a particular kind. It came with a choice of condiments that felt like a serious decision at the time, and it had that uniform, perfectly oval shape that suggested the involvement of some very determined machinery somewhere in its origin story. It was not chicken in any form that resembled the bird it had come from, and yet this never seemed to bother anyone. It was just the chicken sandwich, and it was good, and that was enough. Hot dogs occupied a more complicated territory. They appeared regularly, sometimes on a bun, sometimes in what was called a pigs in a blanket configuration, wrapped in a soft dough and baked until they developed a particular sheen. The hot dog was the cafeteria item most likely to prompt philosophical questions among children who were just beginning to wonder about the nature of things, but it was also the item most likely to be consumed without any further reflection, because it tasted fine and you only had 25 minutes. The sides built the architecture around these main events, and the sides were deeply, specifically of their time. Tater tots were perhaps the most beloved side dish in the entire cafeteria canon. Those little cylinders of shredded potato, fried to a particular golden finish that produced a crunch on the outside and a soft, almost fluffy interior, were so culturally embedded in the school lunch experience that they became inseparable from it. There is a reason tater tots appear in nostalgic films and television about this era. They were not just food. They were a shorthand for the whole experience. Green beans from a can, heated until they achieved a softness that fresh green beans will never naturally reach, appeared on nearly every tray at some point during the week. The government surplus system meant that certain vegetables showed up reliably regardless of season, and canned green beans were a staple. Alongside them, corn, also canned, also steamed to that particular pale yellow, and occasionally mixed vegetables that seemed to include every color in the spectrum but to have started from a frozen bag sometime in the previous decade. None of this was gourmet. All of it was somehow comforting. Mashed potatoes were a different category of side altogether, because good cafeteria mashed potatoes, the ones made from real potatoes by someone who knew what they were doing, could actually be delicious. They came with a divot in the center that the lunch lady would fill with a ladle of brown gravy, and on the right day with the right cook behind the counter, this was genuinely satisfying food. The instant variety, made from powder and hot water, was more common and considerably less satisfying, but even those had their defenders. The rolls. The dinner rolls. You cannot tell the story of the 80s and 90s cafeteria without stopping on the rolls. They were soft, pale, slightly sweet, served warm, and they came from some industrial bakery that supplied schools across entire regions, which meant that a kid in Georgia and a kid in Oregon might be eating the exact same roll without ever knowing they shared this experience. They were the thing most likely to be eaten first, or traded away, or used as a projectile in a moment of poor judgment that was swiftly dealt with by the lunch monitor. Dessert at the cafeteria operated under its own logic. The options were never elaborate, but they had a kind of rotating reliability that made them anticipated. Chocolate milk was less a dessert and more an upgrade. The choice between white and chocolate felt like one of the more consequential decisions of the school day, and choosing chocolate was always a small act of self-determination. Brownies appeared regularly, dense and room temperature, cut into perfect squares. Jell-O occupied a peculiar category. It was neither really a dessert nor really a food, and yet it appeared, wobbling in its small cup, in colors that do not occur in nature. Pudding came in chocolate and vanilla and occasionally butterscotch, served in those same small cups with a plastic spoon, and was consumed with the straightforward pleasure of something that required no thought at all. Ice cream days were a separate institution. Some cafeterias had a freezer unit built into the counter. Others had an ice cream truck arrangement that arrived on certain days and involved a separate line and a separate transaction that felt almost illicit in its independence from the regular meal. The options were usually simple: a creamsicle, a fudge bar, a vanilla sandwich, but the choosing of them felt significant, the way small choices do when you are 10 years old and most of your day is decided for you. The social architecture of the cafeteria deserves its own consideration, because where you sat was never just about finding an empty chair. The cafeteria in those decades was a kind of ecosystem with its own territories and traditions that were entirely unwritten but completely understood by every student who entered the room. Tables near the windows were premium real estate. The long tables with attached benches defined a particular kind of communal eating that you almost never experience anywhere as an adult. You sat close enough to people you might not have chosen to sit with, which sometimes led to connections that wouldn't have happened otherwise, and sometimes just led to a very quiet Tuesday lunch. The lunch ladies who operated this system were often underappreciated and long tenured, the kind of employees who had been working in the same kitchen for 15 or 20 years and knew the rhythms of the school better than many of the teachers. They remembered which kids always took seconds of the corn dogs and which ones always tried to get an extra brownie. They enforced rules about not taking more than one milk, and they occasionally broke those rules for a kid who looked like they needed the extra one. They were a consistent and recognizable presence in what could be an inconsistent and disorienting place, and many people who grew up in this era remember specific lunch ladies by name and with genuine warmth. The cafeteria itself as a physical space had a kind of universality across American public schools that was striking. Whether you were in a suburb of Cincinnati or a small town in New Mexico or a mid-sized city in the Pacific Northwest, the physical ingredients were remarkably similar. Folding tables that could be collapsed and pushed to the walls for an evening event. Linoleum floors in a pattern that could conceal almost any spill. Windows that were usually placed high on the walls, letting in light without letting you see out. A serving counter with a sneeze guard. A cashier station at the end where you either paid with cash or handed over a punch card or, by the 90s, began to interact with some early electronic payment system that always seemed to be malfunctioning. A garbage station at the far end where you scraped your tray and stacked it in a rack before the lunch ladies washed them for the next period. And then the bell rang, and it was over, the whole machinery reset. New trays. New kids. The same corn dogs. The same green beans. The same chocolate milk in the small carton that you could never open on the first try without bending it. What happened to this world is a long and somewhat complicated story involving nutritional policy changes, increased privatization of school food services, wellness initiatives, and the gradual entry of recognizable fast food brands into the school environment. By the early 2000s, many of the classic items were being phased out or reformulated. The rectangular pizza remained, more or less, because some things are beyond the reach of nutritionists. But the corn dog became less common. The sloppy Joe started to disappear. The tater tots came under scrutiny. And the communal tray itself, that fundamental object, was in many schools replaced by individual plates or biodegradable containers that changed the whole feel of the meal. What you're left with, if you grew up eating that food, is a very particular kind of nostalgia. Not nostalgia for the food exactly, though some of those dishes genuinely were good, but nostalgia for the complete experience. The smell. The noise. The tray. The warm roll. The cold chocolate milk. The 25 minutes of relative freedom in the middle of a structured day. The sense that wherever you were sitting, whatever was happening in the hallways or the classrooms, for this brief window you were just a kid eating lunch with other kids, and the corn dogs were the same today as they were last week and would be the same next week, and there was something deeply reassuring about that particular continuity. If you went to school in the 80s or 90s, you already know what I'm talking about. You've been there in your memory for the last several minutes, haven't you? The tray. The line. The smell of that cafeteria. Some things stay with you longer than you expect.